Here's a question. What exactly is the difference between a series circuit and a parallel circuit? Now this is a little cartoon of a series circuit here. The electricity comes out of the battery and goes through each of the light bulbs in series. That means one after the other before returning back to the battery. Now contrast that with a parallel circuit. In a parallel circuit, the electricity comes out but then immediately branches and splits, going through each light bulb in parallel with one another before recombining and going back into the battery. Now the main difference in these two different configurations is that in the series situation, it's simpler, first of all, and also if one of these light bulbs burns out or becomes inoperative, it completely interrupts the current flow in the entire circuit. So if this bulb burns out, then all three bulbs go off, basically. If this bulb burns out, all three bulbs go off, and the same with this one. Now in the parallel configuration, if this bulb burns out, because it's in parallel, the electricity can still flow through the other bulb and keep it illuminated. So for light bulbs, you never really want to connect them all in series because you don't want all of them to go out if you have a bulb burn out. In this case, if one of them goes out, the other branch still has electricity flowing through it. Now when you think about it, the filament of a light bulb behaves like a resistor with a certain resistance. So we'll replace the diagram with the same situation, a battery, some electric current, and you're encountering the elements in series. So this is a series circuit. If you want to find out what the total resistance is as seen from the battery in series, because it's one after another, effectively all you're doing is you're adding up the resistances there. So as you add resistors or light bulbs in series, you're increasing the total resistance as seen by the battery looking into the circuit. Now here's a similar diagram looking at a circuit that has elements in parallel. There is an equivalent resistance equation, but it looks quite different. You have these fractions and so on. What this basically means is that the resistance looking from the battery, as you add more and more elements, the resistance actually goes down. Because think about it, even if I make this element very high resistance, high resistance, high resistance, if the first element has a low resistance, it still has a path to go around back to the battery. So no matter how many elements or resistors I add in parallel, the total resistance looking through all those parallel arrangements has to go down, because even if I add a lot of different resistors, I'm just adding more paths for the electricity to come back to the battery. And it's important to be able to add up resistances for different circuits to use Ohm's law. Today I want to talk about something you've seen every day, but it's so common that we forget how incredible it is, and that is how exactly do substances like salt, which I have in this image here, or sugar or some other substances, how exactly do they dissolve in water? And what is the difference between the concept of dissolving and the concept of dissociating? Because they are different things. Now, just to drive the point home, here is some salt, here is some water. Let me put some in there. And just look at how cool this actually, how fast this actually happens. Just a little agitation, and it just seems to disappear before your very eyes. And you know, when you're young, you do this, and you think that the salt or the sugar or whatever it is actually disappearing. You know, you think it's like a magic trick. But actually, as you get older and you study a little bit science, you realize that somehow that salt or that sugar has broken down, and the individual atoms and ions that were there are now just in between the water molecules. But how exactly does that happen? And why, if you try to put this salt in oil, no dissolving happens at all? So it all boils down to understanding the water molecule. So here we have H2O. H2, there's two hydrogens, one oxygen. But oxygen pulls electrons really strongly. So these are shared electrons between the hydrogen and this oxygen, and shared here as well. But the oxygen pulls the electron cloud closer to it and closer to it this way. So in a water molecule, the oxygen is very slightly negative because it's pulling the shared electrons closer, and the hydrogens are very slightly positive. So even though this molecule is neutral from far away, no charge, the When you zoom into the oxygen, it's very slightly negative, and the hydrogens are very slightly positive. That's called polar, and it's critical. So here's what's floating around in your glass of water. You have an H2O molecule with a very slight negative charge on the oxygen, very slight positive charge on the hydrogen. And when you have salt, you have sodium chloride, which is in a crystal lattice, and that's the positive and negative charges right there between sodium, which is positive, and chlorine, which is negative. So when you zoom into crystals of table salt, you'll see this alternating pattern of sodium, chlorine, sodium, chlorine, sodium, chlorine, and it's in this three-dimensional lattice. The water molecules, which are charged on their extremities, surround these things and physically rip them apart through attractive forces. So the breaking down that's happening is literally ripping apart the sodium chloride lattice at the microscopic level. That's called dissociation into ions. Similar thing is happening to sugar, but it's not breaking down into ions, it's just breaking down the individual sugar molecules. I want to talk today about the difference between energy and power. And you have everyday experience talking about both of these, and most people think they're exactly the same thing, but they're not. They're totally different quantities. So we're going to say this a few times to make sure it sinks in. I want you to think of energy as the capacity to do work, to make a change in the world, to move something. So energy is the quantity of something necessary to effectuate some sort of work. But power is how fast the energy is taking place over. In other words, power is energy flow per unit time. So whereas energy is how much capacity you have to make some change in the world, do some work, the power incorporates the concept of time and how fast the energy is used or dissipated. I want you to start to think of energy as the amount of liquid level in a glass of water. The quantity of the water that you have represents the amount of energy you have to make some change in the world. But how fast you pour it from the glass, you could dribble it out very slowly. That would be a low power because the energy is being drained very slowly. Or if you dump it out really fast, you would have a very high power output because you're dumping the energy out very, very fast per unit time. So again, energy is measured in a quantity called joules, and power is measured in a quantity called joules per second, right? So it's just like meters is distance and meters per second is velocity. Joules is energy and joules per second is power. But we rename joules per second into a new thing that we call watts. So anytime you hear a unit of watt, you need to think joules per second. Now, energy itself can come in different forms. You can have kinetic energy when something is moving really, really fast or even really slow. It'll have different amounts of energy of motion. When it slams into something, it can do some work, knocking down bowling pins, for instance. Or you can have a rubber band, which is potential energy. It's not doing much, but when you let it go, it has the potential to do work. Or raising yourself up on a ladder gives you more gravitational potential energy. These are all different types of energy, but they're all a quantity that is measuring how much work you can do eventually with it. So energy is how much work you can do, and power is how fast you're doing it. Now let me ask you a simple question. Here is a fire. We see logs which are burning, releasing heat and light. Once something is on fire, it continues to burn until the fuel is totally exhausted, unless you don't have enough oxygen, in which case it stops because of oxygen starvation. Now here is a simple piece of paper. We know that in order to burn something, you need fuel, which can be this paper. You need oxygen, which is in the air. It's touching and banging into this paper at a molecular level all the time. But you also need kindling, some kind of heat source or a spark. Three things you need to make fire. But here's the question. If this piece of paper is bathed in trillions and trillions of oxygen molecules, O2, banging into it all the time, why doesn't it just spontaneously catch on fire? Why do you have to hold a flame, which is already a piece of something on fire, to begin the burning process? And why, whenever the burning process starts, the paper will continue to burn until the fuel is completely gone, again, assuming you have enough oxygen. In other words, how does fire actually start? And why doesn't this fuel, which is constantly bathed in oxygen, spontaneously catch on fire? Now I want you to pretend this is an O2 molecule, like it's in the air, two oxygens, and you have electrons being shared. This is an atom of, really, it's hydrogen in my model kit, but you could say it's part of the wood or something, the fuel, in other words. They're banging into each other all the time, but no burning is happening. It only burns when you put a flame or a heat source up there. Why? Because as you make this hotter, the oxygen and the fuel, then they're going to bang into each other with more energy. That's what being hotter and higher temperature means. Eventually, you're going to reach a threshold where you bang into this thing with such force that the chemical bond holding the oxygens together breaks apart and they're temporarily freed. Now, of course, they're going to want to rebond with each other, but if there's a piece of fuel there that's attracting the electrons there, and maybe the fuel is breaking apart as well, once you break it apart enough that they can find a new partner, that the electrons can be in an even lower energy state, then the burning process starts. Just like throwing a rock off of the top of a mountain, once you start, it's going to go all the way down the mountain. Now, this process that I described is called kindling. You have to raise the fuel up to a temperature where the combustion process can start. But as soon as some of these things break apart and rebond with each other, the electrons go into a lower energy state that heats up the products and causes further agitation, which makes it easier for the next atom beyond what has burned to break down, and with the oxygen to break down, and for the combustion to continue to happen. So it's a chemical chain reaction. Once you start burning, the heat released continues to allow the activation energy to be overcome, allowing the combustion to continue. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about just how ridiculously fast the speed of light really is. Now, we know that light itself is an oscillating magnetic field and an oscillating electric field propagating through space with no medium. It comes in chunks or packets of energy called photons. And the speed of light is always the same number, no matter how fast you are moving or no matter how fast the source of the light is moving. In numbers, the speed of light is about 186,000 miles per second. That's a second, that's a second, that's a second. I'm even going a little too fast. 186,000, and so on. That's about 7 times all the way around the planet Earth every single second. In terms of meters, that's about 300 million meters every single second, which is about 300,000 kilometers per second. And that means that a photon can travel from the Earth all the way to the moon in about 1.3 seconds. Now, the Earth is about 93 million miles away from the sun, but even at that distance, it takes light about 8 minutes to travel from the sun to the Earth. And that means that if the sun somehow just disappeared right now, we wouldn't even know about it for about 8 minutes. Now think about how fast light is, 7 times around the Earth in 1 second, but yet it still takes light about 8 minutes to get to the sun. That tells you 2 things. Light is really ridiculously fast, and the universe and everything in it is ridiculously spaced out far apart. At the other end of the solar system, we have Neptune here, which is about 4.5 billion kilometers away, and it takes light about 4 hours to travel all the way out to Neptune. Here's another picture with the sun at the center. The heliopause is the boundary of the solar wind, and it would take light about 17 hours to reach the edge. But that's not where the solar system stops. After that, we have the Kuiper Belt and then the Oort cloud. It would take light about 2 years to reach the edge of the Oort cloud. Here's a cartoon of the Milky Way with 2 satellite galaxies that we have. The Milky Way is about 100,000 light years across. It would take light about 100,000 years to cross our galaxy. The Milky Way has a couple of satellite galaxies that you can see right here, which are about 200,000 light years away. And the Andromeda Galaxy is about 2.5 million light years away. Learn anything at mathandscience.com.